It's so great to have you here with us, Snigdha, because we've been looking for more people to comment on what's happening with COVID in terms of, members of the media. And we're talking about anybody from journalists to political commentators to publishers such as yourself, with Juggernaut being such a premium platform for South Asian publishing. Talk to me a little bit about what is happening on the publishing end right now when we're looking at COVID-19 and what's happening with the crisis. And I know you're a digital platform, so you're still producing on a daily basis. So talk to me about what some of those strategies have been into what the content should be right now with Juggernaut.
Sure. Yeah. Let's start first with the impact of COVID on media businesses. What's been really interesting during this time is if you look at website data or traffic data, a lot of media companies are actually experiencing spikes in unique visitors, as well as increases in engagement time, as in people are staying at home, they're reading more, they're watching more, and you can see these phenomena through, the virality of Tiger King on Netflix, or the fact that the New York Times has nearly almost doubled its monthly traffic in the last 2 months, and even seeing, people like you still continuing to report during this time because people are still craving knowledge about not just COVID, but you kind of see a bifurcation. You see there's a bunch of consumption on COVID news, but then there's also a bunch of escapism, which explains Tiger King. People don't want to be reading about COVID 24/7 all the time for many people. And so they're seeking those kind of two types of entertainment, which is informative news, or let me just kind of escape it and enjoy cooking or doing something else. You're also seeing the rise of Instagram Live because of that. In terms of how publishers prepare for that, I think their challenge is going to be, how do we convert this increased engagement and this increased traffic into revenue? Because a lot of media publishers who rely on advertisers are realizing that a lot of advertisers are pulling back extra spending. They're also realizing, because they're providing so much COVID content for free, so are we, that stuff isn't translating to revenue. So that's going to be their challenge. In terms of what we're doing on the ground, the way we operate is we work with over 100 freelance journalists around the world. And the benefit of the way journalists can operate, as you are doing right now, is that we have obviously advised all our journalists, please try not to do field reporting, in the sense that, you don't need to go meet people in person right now. So all of our journalists have been doing phone calls and getting as much information as possible by calling as many people and, being safe. So we've still been able to operate. In terms of the content we're covering, we were some of the first to cover a lot of the potential impact of COVID on South Asia. So when everybody was focused on China and America and Italy, as early February, before people realized it was a global pandemic, we reported on, here's what scientists are expecting will happen in South Asia. And unsurprisingly, a lot of scientists were saying, well, India isn't a global travel hub, so India won't be impacted, which is, when you really think about it, is kind of ridiculous. What ended up happening with India is that the first 3 cases were in Karnataka from students who had studied at Wuhan. That's fine. So a lot of it came from Wuhan. But then the second spike came from Italian tourists who entered via Delhi and then went to Rajasthan. Right. So what people have forgotten is that actually India has become a really hot tourist destination. Delhi has risen in the ranks to become one of the 11th most popular cities for people to travel into. So when you look at that new reality, you realize that Western media is still catching up to the ground reality of India's growth and India's popularity and just general kind of travel in South Asia.
Yes.
I don't know if I can put it before.
And just talking a little bit more about that, Snigdha, since you started talking about it, let's dig right into it. India, suddenly it's come on the maps for coronavirus. The entire nation is on such a strict lockdown. It's actually more strict than what's happening here, because in India, the entire country is on a lockdown for 21 days. They're really, really, really trying hard to sustain it, to contain it. You started your field reporting and actively reporting from the ground in February. Tell me the findings you have found so far with COVID-19, its impact on India, and also, how ready is India? That's another question that everyone keeps on asking.
Yes. So in terms of what we found on the ground, we've had lots of flavors of coverage. We have the early coverage of what other people are saying, which is South Asia won't be hit. We then had another article before India announced a lockdown saying, actually, people are taking it quite chill. People were still meeting up. There are been multiple religious gatherings, both Muslim and Hindu across India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka. So that was quite surprising that these religious gatherings across religions were still happening. And our journalists were finding, like, why is this happening? Like, how are we not more worried? The way the virus spreads, as you know, is, right now is people to people, and it lasts, for a bit also on surfaces. So
Right.
The big thing that scientists know is that dense cities are going to be hit worse. And India has some of the biggest cities, so does Pakistan and Bangladesh. So of course we expected that to eventually catch up. In terms of whether India is prepared, I think the typical, or even Pakistan or Bangladesh, the typical storyline is India doesn't have enough hospital beds, India doesn't have enough ventilators, etc. And to go back to why, sorry, I'm so sorry.
It's fine. No problem.
So to go back to why, that's, the usual coverage is because, the whole media, the easiest to digest kind of communication has been, let's flatten the curve. Let's make sure there's not a huge spike such that all these hospitals are not overwhelmed.
Right.
And because of that, I think India had to act really fast, which is why they did a national lockdown, because they realized that, hey, look, we're actually quite vulnerable. And they'd waited so long that in a way, that was some of the only options available to them.
Right.
In comparison, China never really implemented a full strict national lockdown. It was also at an earlier stage of the virus, of course, and they had much more concentrated lockdowns around Wuhan and other epicenters. India kind of went whole hog. Now, one of the impact, we had an article out yesterday, is on its migrant workers. India has one of the biggest populations of domestic migrant workers. I'm not talking about workers coming in and out of countries. I'm talking about internal migration.
About 120 million.
120 million.
Yeah.
So it's 1/5 of the entire workforce.
Yeah.
So these people call their usually villages home, and they come to big industrial cities like, Bombay or Delhi to work. Now, the situation was such that the announcement of the lockdown was on Tuesday evening, 4 hours before the lockdown came into effect. And this created mass panic. And, the situation is complicated, which is, of course, the nation had to act fast. India is extremely vulnerable. But the flip side is it actually put a lot of the most vulnerable at risk. Because as you know, like, the concept of home is actually a very, a physical home is still very Western, in the sense that at least 68 million Indians say they have unstable or not even permanent kind of housing structures to even go home to or have a home. And it also means that many of the people who left these cities were these migrant workers, because if they ever got sick, they'd rather be home where they can at least get a daily meal. And second, they just lost their daily wages.
And in terms with those migrant workers that you were talking about them, Snigdha, could you reflect upon the information and the facts you and your team has found on the conditions these migrant workers are? There's a lot of debate upon what's happening. Do they have enough shelters for them? Is there enough food for them? Their travel has been banned. There is a travel ban in India. You can't even walk. Before you were able to walk, now they're even being stopped from walking to go to their villages, which is so far away for certain people. Your take on what's happening on the ground for that?
So one thing that's that our reporter found, Kritika Vargar, who did this beautiful piece, she found that actually India, because it's an agricultural country still, actually has a lot of food stored, which is really helpful. The second thing she's found is that India has now acted fast to help its migrant workers. So they have something called the public distribution system. It serves 800 million Indians, and it's a distribution system that helps distribute food. They also have something called Jan Dhan bank accounts, which helps India's underbanked and unbanked have bank accounts. And the Indian government has released a stimulus package as a stopgap to deliver cash into these accounts. Now, the flip side of that argument is, if India knew this was happening, why couldn't they have prepared for this ahead of time and use those existing infrastructure systems to actually pre-transfer cash, knowing that people are losing their daily income, and pre-transfer food, because the food supply did take a shock, and it took a while to bring it back. Right. The other thing is you're seeing is that certain states have really become exemplars of how they handled COVID, which is similar to America. California has become a shining example. Right. Cuomo has apparently earned fans. Similarly, the chief minister of Kerala has come out as a very big champion of a humane way to deal with COVID. Kerala has erected lots of temporary shelters to house at least 144,000 migrant workers. They've been really trying hard to deliver food, and and help. So, and the second thing I'm noticing, and our reporter noticed, is usually Indians are not associated with philanthropy. That is usually does not go together in India. And so many stars, Bollywood stars, companies, etc., have actually started donating to the Prime Minister Fund because people realize.
Mobilizing.
Pardon?
They're really mobilizing on the ground right now, or they're trying to at least.
Yeah, they're definitely mobilizing. And I don't think you've seen this kind of philanthropy for a long time. And not many big, India is definitely dominated business-wise by large, big families who have industrial kind of businesses. And you're seeing many of them starting to pitch in and donating. And it's really, you saw Amitabh Bachchan just did a Bollywood video where he partnered with like Ranbir Kapoor, Priyanka Chopra to shoot a short video where everyone was just within their homes, but it panned across to make a point that, hey, we need to all stay home. And they're starting a fund to donate to the daily Bollywood wage workers who, they live paycheck to paycheck. They're not the stars. So I think people are realizing the true impact on these people.
But in terms of just discussing the impact and discussing what is happening on ground and what is predicted, what are you seeing as some of those uncertainties for India? When you are reporting all of the facts and figures coming from on ground, when your reporters are trying to figure out how much migrant community is being helped, what are their needs and necessities of the hour, what is happening in terms of the hospitals, the PPE, the full readiness of India, your take on what will happen in case there is an exponential rise of cases, and your take in general as to, where the focus is right now for India.
Yeah. Look, I'm not an oracle, but what I can say based on the reporting that has come back and what I've read and what our reporters have reported, I think what's dangerous now, the next phase, is that basically the way I view the world is there was a first phase, a second phase, and a third phase of the pandemic. The first phase was quite localized. It's, you start seeing cases in China, and then you start seeing a lot of cases in the countries that had the most trade or border or travel with China. That's South Korea, Japan, etc. Travel hubs like Thailand. The second phase was a lot of tourists, a lot of people who finally came from those kind of countries and visited Western countries like Europe and Italy and America, which is the current phase we're in. The third phase, I think, is going to be South Asia and Latin America and African countries who are kind of seeing that travel finally get to where they are and lead to a rise in spikes. India still has one of the lowest testing rates in the world, which means that the current number of cases, which is around 5,000 in India, is vastly underreported. The current number of deaths, 150, also feels vastly underreported. The first death in a very dense slum just also occurred a few days ago, which means that, as we talked about, the disease spreads in dense areas, which means that density is not in India's favor right now. So in terms of what's going to happen next, I do think, unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit about what's played out in America and its biggest cities happening also in India in the next phase. And that's going to extend. And we still don't know. A lot of people are saying, oh, this virus doesn't really survive in hot weather. We still don't know that impact truly yet. So let's see what happens this summer.
Do you think it's been reported correctly in India right now? Do you think when you look at the press coverage is there in comparison to certain outlets that are, the Western media outlets? Of course, there is a huge change of, narrative that we see in both reportings. As a South Asian American entity ourselves, we see that. Your take on what's happening with reporting there, and do you think it's being done correctly?
So I think there's like two levels of that. Is the reporting correct and factually correct? And the second level, I think, is the reporting giving true depth to the situation at hand. The first part, I do think Western media, for the most part, thankfully, is still pretty reliable when it comes to fact checking and reporting the facts, 100%. The second part, where we think the Juggernaut really lends its expertise, is on depth, which is we try to stay away from sensational headlines like, poor, dirty quarantine facilities in South Asia are terrible. Of course, that's what people feel sells. Or India's poorest, most vulnerable with COVID. Again, is that really truly giving depth to the story at hand? Because a lot of Western media coverage has been around still to this day. It's 2020 on India's poverty, or India doesn't have any hospitals, or enough hospitals, or there are too many people in India. that doesn't really truly, like, that's why when we covered the migrant worker story, a lot of people were focusing on, hey, these people are poor, etc. We focused on, okay, let's get past the point that these people might be the most vulnerable poor. We started analyzing, okay, so how have other people come together to help? Like, what's been the helping response? Because no one's really going into depth in that. How are different states helping? How are different civilians helping? How are tech companies in India helping? Because we now have this tech ecosystem. And when you start looking at that, it adds more depth to the problem, because you kind of understand what are even the tools India has to deal with these problems. Most people aren't writing about the public distribution system or Jan Dhan bank accounts. They're not, because they're not even getting to that level. So I think in that regard, I would say, yes, Western media is definitely reporting factually. Can it push itself to add more depth? Yes.
Yes, for sure. And, for everyone that's watching us here on ITV Go, the reason we're both discussing this is because Juggernaut offers in-depth stories, real stories. They are fact-checked, they're detailed, they are, oriented with just a lot of knowledge and information. And I can say, because I've read some of the articles myself, Snigdha, when you're talking about having this a huge platform of media, right? And we're discussing a pandemic right now. How has the reporting been, covering, the stuff that's happening here in the United States? Because, you're living here, you're catering to the South Asian American diaspora. You also have to report from back home. Definitely, that's a requirement for pretty much any South Asian media outlet at this point. But, talk to me a little bit about what have you found on the ground here? And there is still so much going on about how we're not ready even now for the worst case scenario. Your take on that and being media during this time period here.
Sure. Yeah. And in terms of the diaspora news that we're covering on COVID, a lot of it is coming up. So stay tuned. As many people know, some of the people on the front lines tend to be South Asian Americans. Some of the people leading the international efforts, like the deputy director of WHO, is South Asian. And so there are a lot of people from the community in America who are really at the front lines, really helping fight. Many of our public companies, biggest public companies, are led by South Asians, whether it's, Alphabet and Google by Sundar Pichai or Microsoft by Satya Nadella. So there's definitely been a lot of people in the community, and there's more coverage coming soon. In terms of what we're observing on the ground, I think I shared this with you, Aditi. So my dad is actually a doctor at Jamaica Hospital. Right. And the second story happening in New York, or a prime thing that people forget, is when people think about New York City, they think about New York City as a whole, or frankly, they really just think about Manhattan. But the true epicenter within New York City has actually been Queens in terms of coronavirus cases. And Queens hospitals have definitely been overrun. There was a New Yorker piece just recently, actually written by one of my friends from high school and college, and his dad unfortunately passed away at Elmhurst Hospital. And many of these Queens hospitals have a lot of cases, are completely overrun with a lot of patients, don't have all the resources they need from PPE, etc. My partner actually worked with a friend of his in China to try to ship PPE to Jamaica Hospital. One of my existing investors, who's originally from New Orleans, is also trying to work with Chinese manufacturers and other manufacturers to ship PPE to New Orleans. So I think there's definitely, it's definitely true. Hearing it directly from my father, who ended up getting diagnosed with COVID because he was helping and, serving in these hospitals, is that, Queens has definitely been hit hard. Definitely is one of the most diverse boroughs in the city. Has a diversity of people doing different jobs who are even more vulnerable because sometimes they can't just afford to just stay at home and not be in contact with people. There's often a lot of new vulnerable recent immigrants who don't have any other choice and end up, going to public hospitals or have to deal with paying for care. There's just a lot more going on that we even haven't really hit the iceberg in terms of how difficult the situation has been for a lot of people. So stay tuned for that. We have more coverage coming. We definitely cannot presume to capture all the stories, but the other stories to be aware of is we did a story on how it's so hard to start an Indian restaurant in America. And there's definitely an entire side story, not a side story, a main story about the impact of this on South Asian run businesses. And we're also trying to cover that. Many Indian Americans run hotel chains, or many Indian Americans run restaurants.
Yeah. For sure. And I think that in terms of your dad, since you have shared that he had COVID-19 due to the fact that he is a doctor and he was treating COVID-19 patients, one, how is he doing? And second, how has his experience been as a frontliner? And, it takes a lot to, serve the community at a risk of getting it and now getting it. I'm sure he'll be back working as soon as he's able to. Could you reflect on how that is for him?
Sure. So, we were texting, and he's definitely his best spokesperson. But if I were to think back to our texts, he basically was the one telling me these hospitals are definitely overrun. There's COVID cases everywhere. He would be super careful as soon as he got home, put everything in the wash, including his lab coat, every day. And no matter how careful he was, he kind of knew in the back of his head the chances of him getting COVID are still really high. In terms of recovery and how strained the hospital system is, he texted me and said, I just got confirmed with COVID. By the way, our hospital's directive is that as soon as you have 3 days of no COVID symptoms, you have to get back to work.
Oh, wow.
Even though the national directive is, hey, please self-quarantine for 14 days, for doctors in New York City systems, what he was telling me is that it's been shortened to, again, each person is different. As soon as you have 3 days of non-COVID symptoms, you have to get back to work. That's how strained the system is. New York City put out an alert for even retired medical professionals to come back because it's just been a huge strain. So, that's his firsthand experience. And, we have to give it to the doctors, to the nurses, to all the medical professionals helping across the board because, it's relentless, right? Day in and day out. You don't really get a day off.
You're so right. Is it humbling for him?
I don't know if it's humbling, and I don't know what you mean by humbling exactly, but I think what I admire most about medical professionals in America is even when I texted him and I said, hey, Dad, you're above 60, you're at high risk for this. You should not be working. There should be even a shift where, medical professionals who are less at risk, rotating. Then second line of defense is medical professionals who are already themselves at risk. And he was like, if I don't go and help them, who will? I think doctors and nurses and all these other medical professionals are it's not just humble, it's their calling, it's their vocation. They will do whatever it takes, and that's what's really admirable.
Well, tell your dad we said thank you for his service, true frontliners, and I hope he feels better very soon. Just continuing our interview, I want to dig a little bit more into Juggernaut since we have you here for a few more minutes. This is a startup company, and it's your brainchild, and it's something that you really wanted to do because you saw that there was a lack of content when it came to South Asian American stories, or what the community here especially wanted to see. Right now, with what's happening with COVID-19 and the economic crisis and the hit on startups and many of the businesses, talk to you a little bit about that experience. And you are a South Asian woman entrepreneur. So how has that experience been for you? And what are you really hoping to achieve as the end goal to get through this crisis sort of smoothly? I know it's difficult, I'm sure. But how do you sort of get through this as a startup such as yours?
We started the Juggernaut because we wanted to promote high quality journalism about the South Asian diaspora around the world, and create a community where people could truly gather in a digital first and in-person way. What we also found, as we've already discussed, is that sometimes Western media doesn't go into as much depth, or many of our journalists would tell us, I've pitched this, to the likes of the New York Times or to these other publications, but they don't see the story here, or they think it's too niche. And we've become a home for really high quality journalism in that regard. In terms of our aspirations, we want to become a household name for the entire South Asian diaspora. We want to be a resource. We want people to think, hey, this was a really good story that I didn't really know about, or I walked away and I learned something that I didn't know otherwise, or I'm inspired to do something different or act differently because I read something here or engaged with something on this platform, or learned about somebody new. So that's really our end goal. It's how do we become just a benefit and valuable for South Asian households across the world who really appreciate what we're doing. The other kind of phenomenon we noticed is that most people don't know US newsrooms are the least diverse workplaces in America.
Yeah.
77% of newsrooms are non-Hispanic white, and it gets worse at the top. If you just look at the South Asia bureau chiefs of most Western media publications, they are not South Asian. And that really affects, in terms of newsrooms, the stories you tell. Aditi, you being part of ITV Gold, you're noticing different stories than if you weren't who you are. And I think some people aren't bringing, people are increasingly realizing your identity can be a boon and a gift in the newsroom because you're connected to audiences who otherwise wouldn't have a voice. And, we work with over 100 freelance journalists around the world. 94% of them identify as people of color, which means that the stories that they're bringing to us and our platform are just truly exceptional and usually aren't found anywhere else. In terms of the impact of entrepreneurs and COVID on entrepreneurs, it's obviously a very difficult time for many, many businesses. Different businesses have different correlations, to the impact. For example, some are completely in person. Some businesses are 100% in-person events, and that's terrifying. Yes, the Small Business Administration passed the CARES Act that allows small businesses to apply for emergency funding and get forgivable loans to pay for payroll, to reduce layoffs. You can also apply for emergency funding for emergency disaster relief. Right. What a lot of startups are seeing is there's definitely a group of startups where ethically they have a lot of cash in the bank. They've raised a lot of venture capital. Many of them have chosen to opt out of applying for these SBA forgivable loans because they don't need the money as much. It's $350 billion. There's millions of small businesses. If you do the math, that fund might quickly run out of money, or it might not be the right triage of the companies that need it most getting it first. So that's quite dangerous. And so I think a lot of startups are making that decision, which is we might be impacted, but if we have cash in the bank, let's wait. So some people are doing that. The way we're thinking about it is, in terms of the Juggernaut, we definitely think that, as we talked about before, media has definitely seen increases in traffic, increase in engagement. For us, our challenge during this time is we've definitely lost in-person event revenue, but we are still doing really strong when it comes to, media subscription and media engagement and consumption. And we're using this period to figure out how do we still create valuable events through Instagram Lives or other methodology to make sure that our audience gets value from us as they did before. We hosted a sold out Bollywood trivia night last December. Can we create an Instagram Live version of that? So I think a lot of our team has now been pivoting to making sure this time is still as engaging and as valuable for our customers. But knock on wood, I think we're going to get through this. Media has been lucky in that regard. It's just going to be a question of how do we ensure we're still delivering value to our customers and making sure we're serving their needs.
Right, and Juggernaut openly talks about being a company that has a lot of angel investors because there are a lot of amazing individuals that truly feel passionate about your company and they want to invest. And I know currently also you are taking in angel investors. I want to talk to you a little bit about that entire investment market and what you have seen. I know you have experience in McKinsey and many other outlets. If you could shed a little bit of light on what you've seen when it comes to our economy right now and what exactly is happening in the world of investment, and perhaps how startups such as yours are still more safe to invest in by these angel investors. I would love to sort of gain some insights on that for our viewers.
Sure. So in terms of what's happening right now, we're funded by a mix of venture capital and angel investors. So I'll take each kind of category and asset class one by one. When it comes to venture capital, a lot of early stage funds are still open for business because many of them have raised money and they still need to deploy. And especially at the early stages, the prices are a little bit lower, the check sizes are a little bit smaller, so you don't need to do as much due diligence anyway. And if the idea seems to be working at an early stage, it's still a safe bet. So why not? So in terms of early stage venture capital, you see a lot of people still deploying. It's definitely slowed down a ton, but people are kind of coming back to it. A lot of venture capitalists are first trying to triage their existing portfolio companies and making sure they have enough capital to get to the other side.
Right.
In terms of later stage venture capital, you're seeing two big trends. You're seeing a lot of older, bigger companies hunkering down and accessing lots of quick capital really quickly. Airbnb just took out a significant amount of debt because they're a travel company. They've been hit really hard. So they need to kind of buffer up their cash reserves to kind of survive the downturn. There's B2B SaaS companies like Notion, which just raised a $50 million round because they felt, hey, why not? Let's use this time. We're growing anyway to raise a later stage round. Definitely due diligence is much higher and people are, you have to kind of pass a higher bar to make that happen. Many startups are trying to delay fundraising right now and are more focused on extending their runway and reducing their burn. Let's talk about angel investors. So angel investors are often, people who are either independently wealthy or have the means in a risk-free manner to invest in startups. And the reason I say risk-free manner in the sense that if an angel investor loses all their money, they would be financially okay. And there are rules in place to make sure not everyone can be an angel investor. There are some controversy over that, but meaning, if you don't have as much money, you can't access this asset class, but it's usually also in place to protect people for, in case of losses. If you're independently wealthy and you're an angel investor and it's your discretionary investment, because the stock market has gone down,
right,
and for the lowest point in about 12 years, many independently wealthy people are actually choosing to invest in stocks right now because they know over time they'll go up anyway. And so that angel investing asset class has definitely been dampened a bit. That said, there are still plenty of angel investors who still have the means to keep investing. So for us, we are always open to working with really smart angel investors, and we usually squeeze them in if we really like them, regardless of the round we're in, because sometimes angel investors are some of your best investors. They're truly passionate about it. One of our investors is the co-founder of Twitch, Kevin Lin. Another angel investor is the former CTO of Coinbase and a former partner in Andreessen Horowitz, Balaji Srinivasan. He's been a big vocal predictor of what's going on with COVID. And these angel investors are just super passionate about what we're doing. They want to see the rise of Asian American and South Asian American voices. And I think it wouldn't matter whether we're in a downturn or an upturn, whether they would invest or not, if they have the means. So I would suggest if you're an entrepreneur during this time, there are different types of money out there. There's still grants available. There's still government funding. Try to tap into your angel networks. And there are early stage VC funds that are still open for business, and try to get a warm intro. So I really think that entrepreneurship can still thrive, and hopefully will force us to be more frugal. Some of the best startups happen during times of recession or downturns. You can think of Uber, you can think of Gilt Group, and other things become true that allow other ideas to become possible.
I know we're running short of time, but I have a couple more questions here to ask you. In terms of your hopes for the rest of COVID coverages, as well as what's happening on the ground here in India, where are you looking at for the next couple of weeks? Where is the focus going to be with Juggernaut?
Our focus is going to be on the South Asian Americans at the helm of the COVID response. There was a doctor who went viral for his comments on Fox News. We're trying to do a feature on him or have him write an op-ed. We probably are going to continue covering the situation in Pakistan and India and Bangladesh quite closely and do follow-up articles on what's next. We're also are opening it up to personal essays. We have a beautiful personal essay coming out on, I don't know if you've noticed this, but many South Asian Americans, when the panic happened and people were trying to buy up stocks of supplies, many South Asian American households are like, well, I have 5 months of dal and 6 months of rice, and I'm pretty much fine. So we have a very personal essay coming out on this South Asian, preservation of food that we've always kind of had, because, growing up, many of our parents or grandparents didn't come from very stable situations. So we've always had achar. We've always had dal lying around the house, not knowing when we could go to the grocery store, or not having safe ways to store things. So we're kind of also tapping into those kind of beautiful personal essays. So in terms of our COVID coverage, I think those are the three areas. How are South Asian Americans at the helm dealing with it? How are South Asian businesses affected? Second, still on the ground coverage of what's happening back home in the homeland. And third, opening up to personal essays about the feelings and more of the emotions around this time.
And, as we're all watching this, everyone on ITV Gold, Senator Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the race of presidency. And Snigdha, I really wanted to get your perspective on that as well, before we let you go here on ITV Gold. This is a huge news that has come today. Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the race, basically leaving, former Vice President Joe Biden an open field for the Democratic nomination. Your take on what happened with the Sanders campaign, and as a publishing house, a media house, what do you have to say about how they rallied together for the last so many months?
Yeah, sure. So we were one of the early ones to cover Bernie Sanders and his popularity among South Asian Americans. So his campaign just really resonated with what we call the rise of the South Asian progressives. They're often younger. They're often, they care about Medicare for all. They care about eliminating student debt. And he managed to really draw a huge support base from this community. And you could also see that from the Queen's Rally he hosted. He had, rapper Anik Khan, who's Bangladeshi American. He tapped into Chaya, which is a Bangladeshi advocacy network and nonprofit. So Sanders really was able to kind of rally a lot of these younger South Asians who really believed in a lot of his vision and a lot of what he stood for. And if you look at the numbers and how he was polling, even in 2016, when you see the numbers, you can see that he specifically had resonance amongst like Pakistani Americans and Bangladeshi Americans, whose parents in 2016 had a smaller rate of incidence of voting for Clinton. So Clinton was much more popular among Indian Americans, for example, and a little bit less popular among Pakistani Americans and Bangladeshi Americans. And Bernie was more popular among them. So you can kind of already start seeing these differences within nationalities, which again are still not the best psychographic to really explain what's happening in trends, but is one metric. So Bernie Sanders going out, he represented a lot to a lot of South Asian Americans. It also helped that his campaign manager was Pakistani American Faiz Shakir. We also interviewed him for the Juggernaut and talked about how he has also influenced Bernie's campaign. When you see somebody who looks like you running a national campaign for one of the leaders of the Democratic candidacy, it changed the entire conversation. 2020, more than any other year, had many South Asian Americans leading national campaigns, from Kamala Harris's campaign manager, Rohini Kosoglu, to Cory Booker, Sabrina Singh, who then went on to work with Bloomberg. So in terms of the way we think about the news, highly suggest you check out our story on Bernie Sanders and the rise of the progressives, as well as our interview with Faiz Shakir, to really understand what's happening with that. So that's kind of our take in terms of what we've seen on the ground. That said, the Juggernaut did not nominate. I just want to make sure we did not officially nominate any candidate. We're just telling you what we're observing on the ground.
But what do you think it means for the Democratic Party now that they basically have their candidate?
Yeah, I think 2020, the elections, is going to be a fraught one in the sense that this was definitely a very crowded field when it started. Continued to have surprise entrants such as Bloomberg. Warren, for example, and Bernie was a huge surprise to people because Warren was actually leading at one point and then kind of had very similar overlapping platforms with Sanders. So now that now that the field is open to Biden, I think there are definitely a lot of people who predicted that Biden would be the ultimate frontrunner. One of the big theories is because he's actually one of the few people who's walked the talk. Right. Sanders has definitely had these big visions, but when you look at his record in the Senate, it didn't always match his vision in terms of execution. So in terms of that, people really thought that Biden would be one of the few candidates who could cut through. At the end of the day, the race is still not won for the Democrats, right? It's not a given. We still have a candidate who is quite old. He definitely has a great track record. He stood by Barack Obama, which makes him very well loved across the board because Barack Obama is well loved. But at the same time, he is definitely older. He's had accusations of people saying he might be going senile based on his commentary and his debate performance. So, Democrats now have their candidate, but I think it's still going to be an uphill battle in terms of figuring out voter participation. We still don't know if Democrats can actually win.
Yes, and I look forward to really following up on that with you throughout this year. Thank you so much for your time here on ITV Go, Snigdha. We really enjoyed having you here. Just one last message for our audience on behalf of Juggernaut and on maybe perhaps what they can look forward to, but also maybe your own message for your own South Asian American community. I know you're really attached to them and your dad is working in the front lines, so just a message out.
Sure, yeah. To everyone, thank you so much for hearing our story and taking the time. The Juggernaut's mission is to truly be of service to you, the community, and deliver really high quality journalism. So this is definitely an open call. Send us any and all feedback, send us any tips, send us any story ideas. Let us know how we can be better and better serve you. We're at hi@thejuggernaut.com, and we're always open to any feedback and any requests and any story ideas. So thank you for listening to our story. We are The Juggernaut. We're a premium publication for the South Asian community, and we hope you continue reading us.